2020 Alumni Fellows presentation, which is Conversations with OSU Influencers. My name is Eve. Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry for a second, I thought I wasn't muted. My name is Eve, and I am a student in CEOS, which is the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, studying environmental science with a double major in psychology as well. Today, we will hear from an alumni fellow, Dr. Margaret Hiza Redsteer, who will be introduced by Roberta Marinelli, the Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, sometimes known as CEOS. On behalf of all of us today, I would like to thank the Alumni Association for producing this webcast and for establishing the Alumni Fellow program. After the presentation, please join us for the question and answer session. Submit your questions by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your browser window. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted online at osualum.com/fellows. After the presentation, please join us for a question and answer session. Submit your questions. I don't know why that was in there twice, but Roberta Marinelli will introduce our OSU Alumni Fellow.
And it is a real pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Margaret Hiza Redsteer as our 2020 Alumni Fellow. I feel that she embodies our deep appreciation for basic research that we have in CEOS. We love CEOS and that acronym, but also an emphasis that at OSU we place on knowledge transfer that serves society, and in her particular case, underserved societies that have a very strong cultural connection to the land on which they live. Dr. Hiza Redsteer is a Native American, a member of the Crow Nation, and has lived on reservation lands both growing up in Wyoming and subsequently in Arizona when she was married to a Navajo man and living on Navajo and Hopi lands. In both of those circumstances, she encountered environmental challenges related to water scarcity, inequitable resource allocation, and also radioactive contamination in these areas. Motivated to improve life for her community and their environmental health, as well as for herself and her family, she took the very difficult steps at that time to escape the poverty and the environmental health hazards and go to college at Northern Arizona University, while also raising 3 children on her own eventually. Her first love was environmental science, but at the time, environmental science wasn't a well-developed field. She wanted to understand water scarcity and water contamination in lands to which she was connected. So she started instead by studying geology, first gaining a master's degree at Montana State University, and then completing a PhD at Oregon State University under the direction of Dr. Anita Grunder, who studies volcanoes, among other things. Dr. Hiza Redsteer won a number of prestigious fellowships during her time as a graduate student, demonstrating again that intelligence coupled with incredible perseverance is powerful and in the end pays off. It's also worth mentioning that her mentor, Dr. Grunder, is also a very spirited, accomplished, and driven individual who remains a vibrant member of our college and our community. And I'm quite confident that the fruit didn't fall very far from the tree in this circumstances. Great mentor-student pairing. Dr. Hiza Redsteer's subsequent accomplishments are significant. After completing her PhD, she went to work with the U.S. Geological Survey and applied a range of skills to help assess and analyze environmental problems on native lands, both from a scientific perspective and bringing that perspective to questions, but also with a sharp eye to how they impacted the community and what the community needed to know. She left USGS after 20 years, becoming a faculty member at the University of Washington in Bothell in the fields of conservation, restoration, and earth system science, where she now inspires the next generation of environmental science students and really stakeholders everywhere who are concerned about the future of the earth. Her work on climate change in Native American communities has led to a very prestigious invitation to serve as a lead author on an intergovernmental panel on climate change, 5th assessment chapter on adaptation, implementation, and change, And this invitation follows other significant contributions to, for example, the National Climate Assessment and the second State of the Carbon Cycle report. Again, a career path filled with accomplishment, distinction, service, and excellence. It's my real pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Margaret Hiza Redsteer as the 2020 Alumni Fellow to the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Thank you, Margaret. Over to you.
Thank you, Roberta, for that really wonderful, and Evie for that really wonderful introduction. It really is my pleasure to be here today. I wanted to start off with a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to share my screen here and talk about the fact that climate change is already underway. Even if we act tomorrow to mitigate the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, there are many places around the globe that have been impacted by climate change. And they will be continue to be impacted by climate change because the residence time of greenhouse gases, particularly CO2, is really long. It's around 200 years. So we will have changes to natural systems continue whether or not we mitigate climate change. So it's really important for us to understand how ecosystems are being affected in order to adapt to the changes that are coming our way. So the changes that are occurring, such as in glacier retreat in high alpine systems, and increased tidal flooding in remote island nations, as well as the advance and expansion of deserts around the world, are some of the changes that are obviously tied to climate change, and are places where also where Indigenous people live. And that's because colonizing societies did not find these areas attractive. And as a result, what we have now is an intersection between Indigenous people and the most sensitive climate regions that we really need to learn more about in order to understand how ecosystems respond to climate change. The desert region that I'm showing you in the upper right here is actually a margin of the Gobi Desert. And part of the reason I wanted to bring up the Gobi Desert is because one of my fellow OSU alums who graduated the same year I did, Osbert's son, teaches at the Beijing Forestry University now, and actually visited me in the field a few years back because although we were in different academic pursuits at Oregon State University, both of us ended up studying sand dunes. So while he was studying sand dunes in the Gobi Desert, I've studied sand dunes on the Navajo Nation in the southwestern US, which is part of a large area of tribal lands that straddle the border of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico in the Four Corners area of the Southwest. It's a large area, about the size of West Virginia. And the climate there typically has two wet seasons. There's the winter snowfall and precipitation, and then the summer monsoon that goes from July to the end of September. And these two wet periods are separated by a dry and windy springtime, which is a time when a lot of wind erosion can occur. And because of my interest in sand dunes, that's a time of particular interest to me. And why would I study sand dunes? It's because a third of the Navajo Nation is covered with sand dunes. And when I started working there as a scientist, I noticed right away that the sand dunes were changing. So I started with using a lot of the analytical tools I actually learned in my time as a graduate student at OSU, doing analytical work on volcanic rocks and applying those same kinds of geochemical tools to look at the composition of sand dunes and their source areas. But sand dunes are also sensitive climatic indicators. So their mobility and shape depend on wind circulation and energy, and soil moisture conditions, how much precipitation there is versus how much evaporation and transpiration occurs, depending on how hot it gets. And that kind of information requires physical data sets that just weren't there. If you take a map of the southwestern US and put dots on it for every weather station, weather observation that we have, long-term data sets for the 20th century, the red dots on the upper three maps are for the average temperature, the maximum temperature, and the minimum temperature. The larger the red dot, the more warming has occurred. The blue dots are where cooling has occurred. But for the most part, you can see that there's quite a bit of regional warming in the Southwest, especially when it comes to minimum temperatures. So understanding those regional trends and then applying them to where the Navajo tribal lands is not a big problem. But when it comes to precipitation trends, what you see in the lower left here, I'm going to use my arrow, this is where the Navajo Nation is located. We have weather stations down here in Southern California and coastal California and Southern Arizona, where you see declining precipitation. But then if you go northward to New Mexico and Nevada and Utah, you see trends that are increasing precipitation. And we have these tribal lands, this big area of tribal lands as an empty space in the middle. So how do you interpret what kind of physical data sets you have? And part of that is just the history of tribal lands. The National Weather Service did have some weather observation sites that were located at trading posts, but as those trading posts closed, those observation sites went away, partly because the National Weather Service has been hesitant to ever put weather station observations on tribal lands. And many of these, the harsh climates that we're talking about where Indigenous people live are areas that don't have long-term meteorological observations, not that much different than here in the US. But we do have local and traditional knowledge, and it's tied to environmental conditions of a particular place. So traditional medicines and subsistence foods that people use, their changes in distribution and availability, depend on climatic conditions and ecosystem conditions and provide important information about change. That's also true for things like traditional place names that often harken back to the conditions of an area when that name was first used to describe it. So for instance, an area that I'm familiar with that I lived in on the Navajo Nation is called Twaflana, which means many lakes. And there were no lakes there when I was living there, and no lakes have been there since the early part of the 20th century. But if you look back at old Geological Survey professional papers, the lakes are in the pictures. So there were lakes there in the early part of the 20th century. So those are the kinds of things that we can look at and help us to understand what kind of environmental and ecosystem and climatic changes are occurring. And the consultations with tribal elders, so it's not just what you ask about, but who you ask that's really important. So we wanted to engage with the ceremonialists, the people who are most knowledgeable about the changes and the conditions that they were seeing, who really were living day to day, depending on how those conditions were. The work was done in the Navajo language, so with Navajo partnerships. One of my major co-authors is a person who's a cultural rights specialist who has worked for the Navajo Nation for many, many years. We had a Navajo Historic Preservation permit to do the work, and it was really a partnership aimed at understanding adaptation needs in the community. So it wasn't just about asking them to provide local and traditional knowledge to us, but it was also about us providing scientific expertise in developing key sites to produce physical data sets that they could then utilize. So in the upper right here, you'll see the man with a blue shirt, Levi Big Gambler. He ended up putting up one of my I ended up putting one of my weather observation sites in his backyard. So that was part of the partnership, is that he would get this physical data set and I would get environmental information from him. And one of the really important things about Indigenous communities too is that Levi could look out his front door and point to the hill where he was born. So he's lived in the area and he's seen the changes and had to survive all of those changes throughout his entire lifetime, living in the same area of the Navajo Nation. So these were really partnerships targeted at helping to provide information to the community for land use planning, but they also really enriched our scientific inquiry and helped us key in on specific changes that we would not have understood very well otherwise. So the observations from tribal elders did provide us a lot of information about the weather, but partly because those weather conditions are what are key to providing the ecosystem needs that they depend on. But they also provide really important descriptions of an area that are really hard for us to communicate in other ways. I can show you a graph of changing snowfall, but if I tell you that the snow was chest high in horses before the 1940s, that kind of description really does bring home the environmental changes that have and climatic changes that have occurred. But in addition to weather observations that did mirror the weather, corroborate the weather observations we were seeing in southern Arizona, so the trends were definitely drawing. There were also really important observations of environmental change that are really hard to model from physical data sets. So even if we'd had weather stations out there with a whole continuous record for the past 120 years, it would really be hard to model how much soil moisture there was and how it changed and at what period in the 20th century it really started to change, or how weather service features were leading to different flora and fauna changes, the number of beavers, cranes, herons, egrets, and the different types of vegetation in the areas and when and where those types of vegetation were there and when they were not. So there was a lot of really important information about environmental change that added a lot of really important and compelling information at the interconnectivity of the ecosystem to the climate. So we were able to then go back and look at surface water features. As I mentioned, there was a lot of corroboration between the observations and what people discussed. This is just a map of the Navajo Nation showing the yellow areas where there was perennial stream flow of water in the rivers and streams in the early part of the 20th century. And by the middle part of the 20th century, those are shown in green. And this is before any really big water resource development or coal-fired power plants or anything like that were developed. In fact, that was a water resource paper that was aimed at understanding whether there was enough water there to actually develop those resources. And then we have an idea of how significant the stream flow has changed over the latter part of the 20th century, because the remaining perennial flow is only in a very small part of the Western Navajo Nation, along the Little Colorado River, where it enters the Colorado. And there are many areas around the Navajo Nation that still have not had any water resource development, where those water surface features are gone. And there are significant water shortages there today that people are dealing with now, especially with a drought that started in the 1990s. So conventional science was really led by the observations and questions that that were initiated by consultations with tribal elders. So our information was really based on the insights that were provided by those observations. When you think about the scientific method, it starts with an observation and a question to develop a hypothesis and decide what kind of data you are going to gather to test that hypothesis. And if you are on the landscape and making observations all year long, you're going to see a lot of differences and seasonal changes that conventional scientists who go and visit an area for weeks at a time are just not going to see. So it was a really insightful process that was really important for providing information to guide physical scientists, as well as to provide, as well as the information that the elders provided. And because the area is poorly monitored, these additional lines of evidence really did help us provide more complete characterization, not just to us, but to other people in the community. Because if you're an individual and you're seeing a lot of changes, it's a lot more powerful to you and really helps you understand that what you're seeing is real when you hear that other people in your community, many other people in your community, also see the same kinds of changes. And so it led us to look at a lot of different types of studies and gathering of different types of data that we wouldn't have otherwise, because we found in vegetation surveys that stabilizing cover that we needed to protect areas from wind erosion really did depend on the soil moisture conditions that had changed in the latter half of the 20th century. And that helps us inform land use planning and what people can expect with drought conditions. So in summary, assessing climate change impacts can really be enriched by partnerships between communities and scientists, between Indigenous communities and scientists, or between local communities and scientists. They can help us inform planning in a meaningful way and engage communities and science partnerships in an era where scientists really need to help translate the work that they're doing in meaningful ways so that people understand how they are enriched by science. But it's a two-way street. The scientists are enriched too. I can't underscore enough how important this work was to guiding my research career. Even though I'm a physical scientist and spend a lot of time gathering geochemical and geophysical data, the observations of tribal elders were really key in helping me develop the research that I have done. So thank you.
Hi again. Thank you so much, Margaret, for the amazing presentation. It is now time for the question and answer portion. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box in the bottom center of your browser window, as mentioned earlier. But while our audience is typing in their questions, I had one to get us started, if that's all right.
Great.
Awesome. So it's kind of a two-parter, but many have written that we know what the problems amplifying climate change are, and we pretty much know how to solve them. what do you think is preventing larger assembly and action to take place? And is there something that you recommend students and or community members alike that they should do to catalyze action on a smaller scale?
That's a wonderful question. And I think part of it comes back to the fact that there are a lot of places where we understand there are climate change impacts occurring. But we don't understand that they're actually occurring outside our front door as well. So yes, these places are sensitive to ecosystems that have seen a lot of change, but the changes are occurring all around us. And I think if we engage in science partnerships that help people to actually do a little bit of observing of their own in public science partnerships, that would go a long way towards helping people understand the urgency of the problem. And in teaching science climate change classes here at University of Washington, I'm often struck by the fact that people understand that we need to mitigate greenhouse gases. But it's not clear to them that even if we start to mitigate greenhouse gases, the impacts that are taking place are going to take place. And we're going to be living with them. And all of us are going to be paying for climate change adaptation until there is some sort of federal policy to help us deal with the impacts. And the more we delay, the more impacts we will be dealing with personally. And I think the wildfires that we're seeing this year really underscore the fact that it's not just Indigenous people anymore. The changes are widespread, and a lot of us are going to be paying for the impacts.
Thank you so much for the answer. We now have a few more questions coming in.
Great.
The first one being from Ryan, who asked, would Indigenous people still have lived in more sustainably if they had the population or the technology that we do today?
I guess that depends on what you do in the population and the technology that you have and what your priorities are. So I would put it that way. And of course, you know, everybody's a human being, and we all have a desire to have warm houses and electricity and all of those things. But how much of it do we really need? And do we always need more?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point to think about. Continuing just rapid fire, quite a few people have questions, including Julia, who asks, have any of your research findings been unexpected?
Absolutely. Especially when it came to the changes in snowfall and soil moisture, frankly, I thought, well, I'm going to do this great baseline study of what the environmental conditions are now, so that when climate change really starts to appear, I will have this great set of data to work with to for instance, sand dunes. I thought I would go out and map where all of the sand dunes were moving and where all of the sand dunes were still stabilized because the moisture conditions were high enough. And they were changing so quickly that by the time I would go back out in the field again, they'd already changed.
Schmitty asks, how can scientists show respect to Indigenous communities and elders when approaching them to collaborate within research projects?
That's a wonderful question. And I think it really comes down to partnerships and mutual respect for one another, mutual respect for each other's knowledge. So approaching a community should have something, you should have something to offer in exchange, to provide an exchange.
The facilitation of relationships is definitely very important,
It is.
now. Emily asks, what pieces of Indigenous knowledge do you think should be incorporated into the daily lives of the general population to help curb practices which further climate change?
There are a couple of things. People are probably familiar with controlled burns and fire management, using fire to essentially setting fires during periods when the fire danger isn't high to help manage the fuel load and also promote the growth of particular plants. I think is a really important and useful thing. It might not do everything we need to do to suppress fire, but it's one thing that we can certainly add to what we're doing now, and think about, you know, the composition of the forests around us and how we manage forests, and also just community relationships, quite frankly. Part of the reason that Native American communities are so resilient is because they're a network of relatives who have relied on one another. Clan relationships are really, really important in helping one another in times of need. And there are many studies out there that show that people, actually the best in people does come out during periods of disaster, when people are relying on one another. And the first initial response is to help one another. And I think we need to help reinvigorate that feeling that we're all in this together, that it's not just somebody else that has a problem, but that we're all in this together. We're all on the planet together, and we rely on one another. And then I think one of the other things I would mention is just the reciprocity to the natural world, and the fact that when we take something from the environment, we need to remember that we take it at a cost, and that the ecosystems we rely on to live on, and for all of our economies to rely on, it needs to stay vibrant and healthy. And without that, there really isn't, there's no planet B.
Oh, thank you for that interdisciplinary and community-based approach or advice. Alexandra asks, something as crucial as traditional ecological knowledge is not utilized to the extent that it should be. How would you suggest going about implementing it into everyday research? Or how would you encourage government and scientists, among others, to utilize it for more research studies, decisions being made politically, etc.?
Well, I think one thing is, traditional knowledge, right? And traditional knowledge holders, unfortunately, are not numerous. But we do have a lot of people who have local knowledge. There are farmers and ranchers that also have livelihoods that are tied to ecosystems and landscapes. We have fishing communities that are tied to ecosystems and landscapes, and we can partner with them and develop research that is part of how we address climate change adaptation in a way that is useful not just for science and for understanding the science of climate change and its impact on ecosystems, but actually helps inform the communities that we live with. So I think it really comes down again to partnerships, but remembering that a lot of people have local knowledge, and not to forget that there's a lot of local knowledge out there that we're not acknowledging at this point.
Thank you. Another one of our listeners would like to know how your personal experience growing up sparked your interest in studying climate change.
What's really interesting about that is that even before I went to college, when I was a young mother living out on the Navajo Nation, I heard stories all of the time about how much things were changing. But I didn't really think that much about them. at the time. And after I had a geology degree and I was looking at the geologic maps of the areas, I wanted to look at the geologic maps in the areas where I used to live. You know, there's just that curiosity, what's there? I started noticing, oh, there's this superficial deposit that looks like a lake deposit, but there's no lake there. Why is that? Gee, I remember somebody mentioning something about that before, you know, I think that was part of it. Is just the stories about change. And also the fact that when I lived there, I really felt like water was such an important problem that we were dealing with already. And that was one of my motivators for going to school. And the fact that water resources were declining so significantly and have continued to decline really ties back to what it felt like living there and hauling water and dealing with poor quality water and all of those issues.
Nancy has another question, which is, you've talked about your findings and how things are changing on the Navajo lands. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific impacts that those changes are having on Native communities?
So, so as part of my work as a USGS scientist, I have had a lot of Native American student internships, and in those internships, some of the things I've had students do is, you know, go plant yourself at a water hauling site and talk to people who come there to get water. How far did they have to go? How often do they have to come there? What do they think about that water resource? And how much is it costing them? And so then we came up with an inventory that the Water Management Office of the Navajo Nation could use to estimate how much people were spending on water to help them advocate for water resource development. So those are some of the strategies that we used. I think that answered the question. Not sure.
I am sure that Nancy appreciated it very much. Alyssa has a question, which is, it was mentioned that certain parts of the Southwest are no longer suitable to grow crops or medicinal plants. How have local tribal communities adapted to these changes?
Well, what's happened essentially is ceremonialists are going farther and farther out to look for plants in higher elevation areas. And sometimes they can't find them. And so there are specific plants that are used in particular ceremonies, for instance, and those ceremonies don't get practiced anymore, some of them, because the plants that were necessary to conduct a ceremony aren't there. And so that also has repercussions for the people who have asked a medicine man for help and for that medicine man's practice, because just like doctors, ceremonialists will have a particular repertoire of ceremonies that they conduct. And when they can't conduct those ceremonies, they don't have other ceremonies that they can then change over to. Each ceremony is to treat a particular issue, and ceremonies have their specialties.
Thank you. Miguel has a question. As a conventional scientist who does not have an Indigenous background, what approaches would you recommend as a way to engage Indigenous communities in a respectful and balanced way?
Do a lot of listening, find out what people need, because the needs are there. As I mentioned, you know, putting weather stations up was something I really needed for my research, but people in the community wanted them too. So if there's some something you can contribute that's equally helpful for your research and for the community, that's a great strategy.
Going back to touch a little bit more on your experience within Navajo nations, Jaden wanted to know, how did the Navajo Nation react to your team's consultation / the research with them and about their land?
So can you repeat that again? I'm not sure I understand.
How did the Navajo Nation react to your team's consultation and research with them about their land?
I got invited to a lot of meetings, especially about things like grazing, because the tribe has struggled with trying to reevaluate grazing regulations. And so I would be invited to go give a talk where people would come and give feedback, community feedback about what they think their community should do about grazing. And this is because as the drought and the aridity have continued, the rangeland has really suffered a lot. There's really not very many places where people can raise livestock. It's gotten too expensive to haul water for them. And because it's such an important part of traditional culture, it's really heartbreaking for people to have to give up on that aspect of their culture. That's something that ties families together. They work on together. And so I would be invited to go to a meeting. It would be announced on the Voice of the Navajo Nation on the radio. This meeting's taking place this afternoon at such and such a place. Come and talk about grazing. So that's essentially what happened a lot, is that I would just be asked to talk to the community quite a bit.
Okay. Another question, one of the listeners is hoping that you can talk a little bit more about your path to a PhD and to OSU, which I'm also interested in as someone who's interested in graduate school.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to give advice because I really let the path fall in front of me rather than thinking things through. So I originally started at the University of Washington for my PhD here in Seattle. And we had a great student housing here and everything, but I didn't get a lot of what I needed in graduate school. And so when Anita Grunder, Dr. Grunder, came to teach at University of Washington, teach a volcanology class at the university, and I took her class, I was really amazed by her knowledge and also by how willing she was to help provide input into the research I was doing. And I thought, well, what am I doing here at the University of Washington? I think I'm going to go to OSU. And so by a roundabout way, I ended up at Oregon State University. Instead of the University of Washington, I left a year of RA support behind because I knew it was the best choice for me to make. And I think I wouldn't have finished or had as great of a graduate school experience if I hadn't done that.
Well, Oregon State feels very lucky to have had you. Another question coming in from Jalen. How drastically could the Navajo Nation's environment change over the next 20 years?
Oh, well, that really depends a lot on, of course, on what we do. But the big problem now is that elderly people on the Navajo Nation don't have a lot of resources, but they also still live a subsistence lifestyle. And so they're trapped. They don't have a lot of job skills or education or even proficiency in the English language to move somewhere else and get a job. However, younger generations do, and they're leaving. They're leaving, schools are closing, grade schools and high schools are closing, and elderly people are being left on the living on the reservation on their own, and then families come home on the weekends to help them out. And so there's a real heartbreak and generational divide between who's being left on the reservation and who's leaving. And then of course with COVID, it's so much worse because people can't travel back and forth right now. So a lot of elderly people are on their own, and younger people are leaving. And unless they can get some help, especially with water supplies and with diversifying their economic development so that they're not so dependent on livestock, there really aren't a lot of good options for some places. Some of the wetter areas may still be okay, some of the more mountainous regions, but the low-lying desert regions are just emptying out, and it really is heartbreaking.
I can only imagine. How did you become involved with the IPCC and come to be an IPCC lead author?
You have to be nominated. And I was lucky that there's a woman within the U.S. Geological Survey who was heading the Global Change Research Program. And she and a number of colleagues working on that program nominated me. And then once you're nominated, then you have to submit your research record, your publication record, and then they have to decide whether or not they will accept you as an author. So I was surprised and very happy to be accepted, but I think part of the reason is because the IPCC has recognized that they need more information from Indigenous lands, that those are lands that are really sensitive to climate change, and that they're not that well monitored. And in order to do complete climate assessments, they really needed to bring in as many people that have the expertise in Indigenous studies as possible.
A question from Kaplan. Is there a land use change signal here, as well as affecting vegetation cover, such as the introduction of domestic livestock grazing? If so, can this signal be separated from the climate signal?
They can't be completely separated out, but for the most part, what I've seen looking at climatic information is that the changes to aridity, the amount of soil moisture available in areas, is so dramatic that even if you had one cow, it would not matter. If you had 0 cows, you would still see a change. The changes that I've seen from areas with livestock, because we have done a lot of seasonal vegetation surveys, is a big change in the palatable vegetation. So livestock has had a big impact on the type of vegetation cover, more than the amount. So in my studies, seasonal studies of vegetation, I've replanted grass, native grasses, and looked at how they responded to different soil moisture conditions with a weather station sited and soil moisture all co-located. And what would happen to those grasses is essentially, if they were in the wrong place, they blew away, like roots and all. Whereas in areas where there's a lot of livestock, the vegetation would still be there. It just wouldn't be vegetation that any animal was going to eat.
Right, well,
I hope that helps.
No, I can't necessarily speak for the people asking the questions, but I think we can all agree that it was really informative to have you answer as many questions as you did. So thank you so much. We're now going to bring our Dean Marinelli back on, if she'd like to put her camera back on. Thank you so much. But thank you all to have joined us today. Join us this week for another great conversations from other of our amazing alumni fellows. Some of our additional presentations are Thursday at 10 a.m., at noon, 2 p.m., and 4 p.m., all Pacific time. Our panel discussions with all of the 10 fellows and OSU's President Alexander is going to be on Friday at noon, again Pacific time. The schedule and previously recorded conversations can be found online. Again, just plugging the website, it is osualum.com/fellows. If you're interested in learning more about CEOS, or the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and the work that they're doing within the community, you're more than welcome to like their Facebook page or visit their website. And then again, Dr. Hiza Redsteer, I especially want to thank you and congratulate you for being chosen as a 2020 Alumni Fellow.
Well, it's a great pleasure and an honor, and I'm really appreciated all the questions. It's great to have the interest. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much.
And I would also like to add my thanks to Margaret for a very compelling presentation, and to remind all CEOsians and our broad family members that she will be back with us to give a science presentation in February. And we're hoping that that will be a live, in-person, non-necessarily broadcasted, although optional broadcasting, not mandatory broadcasting. And we'll be sure to keep you up to date on that event as the time draws closer. Margaret, thank you for being an inspiration for all of us. And I certainly look forward to seeing your panel discussion on Friday.
Thanks.